Viewers, we are in the final days of the 21-day lockdown. Though an extension is on the cards, the Prime Minister has been able to prevail upon millions of Indians to stay at home. There have been some challenges, and this was a very difficult option to exercise. In a country where hunger induced by poverty kills many, any lockdown was always going to be about walking the tightrope between the need to save the lives in the face of rampaging coronavirus and yet not condemn millions to an even worse fate as a result of the temporary loss of livelihoods. So how has the government managed this difficult balancing act? Let's put this question to the experts. We are joined by Jay Panda, Bharatiya Janata Party spokesperson and the Vice President of the party, and Yogendra Yadav, National President of Swaraj India, Shobhana Kamineni, Executive Chairperson of Apollo Hospitals, Chetan Bhagat, author, Gautam Chikarmane, Vice President ORF. Let me first begin with you, Mr. Panda. How do you believe the government has fared in the last 2.5 weeks?
Let me give you one statistic which I think will explain it very succinctly. According to ICMR projections, if the steps that the government has taken had not been taken, by now, by around the middle of April, we would have had more than 8 lakh infections. Now compare that to about 6,000 infections that we have had, and this is because of the dramatic steps that have been taken, and this is the reason why India is being complimented around the world by public health experts. And it's not easy because unlike in authoritarian countries where you can simply clamp down, in India, a lot of communications has to be there to convince people. And the Prime Minister's exhortations have been contributing to this. Let me give you 2 other statistics to show you the level of preparedness. So as of today, more than 1.5 lakh hospital beds in India have been dedicated for COVID patients. And, with the number of infections around 6,000, you can see that we are well ahead of the curve in preparations for this. We have many, many thousands of ventilators already dedicated to these COVID beds. Fortunately, the requirement so far has been only a couple of dozen or so for ventilators. So on many fronts, I think our preparations have been extremely good. But nevertheless, it's a big challenge because, it does affect economic activity. It does put people in difficulties. We have, for example, the issue of the migrant labor in various states. There was a spike in their lack of confidence about a week or 10 days ago, and many of them were trying to go back to their home states. But largely that has been addressed because most states have done well to reach out and provide food and aid to migrants wherever they are stuck. And I personally have spoken to district administrations in many different states. Besides that, there are NGOs and volunteers who are helping. For example, my party also has been reaching out, providing lakhs of meals to people who are needy. Also, stitching a large number of masks at home and distributing them. So overall, I think we are poised at a very delicate stage. Hopefully India will come out of it better than most nations.
Okay, let me ask this question of Yogendra Yadav, Professor Yadav, if you can hear me. Do you believe that the Modi government had succeeded of getting ahead of the corona curve, at least on the evidence of what we've seen in the last 17, 18 days?
Rahul, I agree with Jay Panda that this is a very delicate moment. And in a delicate moment like this, this is not the moment to play opposition for the sake of opposition. This is also not the moment to issue certificates of success. I think we are just too early in the curve to issue ourselves any certificates. The national duty at this moment should be to support the government and help the government to achieve what the government has set out to do. And to do so, the best thing we can do is to give feedback to the government. I heard Mr. Panda carefully. I think it is true we are very low on the curve at the moment, and if we stay at that level, probably in a month's time, we can begin to pat our back and say, okay, we did well. This is rather too early to come to any conclusion. The one thing that worries me, and that's a feedback I wish to give the government, because the government has to take a decision within the next 24, 48 hours about extending the lockdown. It's not going to be an easy decision. We should support the government. But what I was somewhat disappointed, I must say, honestly, in what Mr. Jayapanda said was, he used the word difficulties and so on. I think what we are dealing with a catastrophe. He said difficulties which have largely been handled. I'm astonished to hear that. I really do hope that the government does not take the view that he does, because we are dealing with nothing short of the biggest economic catastrophe that this country has seen. I'm not saying the catastrophe is that of the making of the government, but handling that is a responsibility of the government. And to say NGOs will take care, civil society will take care, state governments will do, no, sir. You have invoked NDMA, which is a national emergency law, and therefore the first responsibility should be that of the central government. I would sincerely hope that this time when the government announces any extension, which it probably will have to in one way or the other, they would also announce serious measures about avoiding food scarcity. Allow me to remind you that even now, we do not have a universal PDS system. For the last week or so, we have heard serious reports which point to the possibility, the dangers of starvation deaths for some parts of the country, for some communities, for some people left out of the PDS. And no, sir, the problem of migrant labor has not been handled. I thought someone as seasoned as you and as clued in as Mr. Panda would know what is happening to migrant labor in most parts of the country. They are in dire straits. Something really big needs to be announced, along with the possibility of lockdown, for which we must support the government.
Okay, Mr. Panda, would you like to respond here? Because certain observations have been made by Yogendra Yadav.
First of all, I would like to say that these are extraordinary circumstances, and this is not just an Indian problem. If you look at the problems that other countries, especially developed countries, are facing, I think by comparison, India has done remarkably well. Now, yes, of course, India and the government has to reach out, and it has been. Let me remind Yogendra ji that India started convening its first group to deal with this crisis on the 8th of January, within a day after the coronavirus being officially recognized by authorities, by China and others. Now, in terms of reaching out to people, yes, of course, it has serious economic impact. And the government has taken many steps in between. For example, rolling out the 1.75 lakh crore stimulus, which is aimed precisely at the bottom of the pyramid. Now, we are conscious that this has many repercussions. It's not just the Prime Minister and the Union government. It is done in coordination with state governments, because the implementing authority for whatever the Union government does, the implementation has to be at the state level. And this is why the Prime Minister has been coordinating in video conference calls with chief ministers.
But Mr. Panda, a large number of state governments are also saying that you haven't released funds that they require. Look, I'll come back to you. I'm getting the drift of what you're saying. You're saying that you're working in coordination with the state governments. It can't be an either or. Fine. Let's just open this out. I'm sure you have points to defend your own record over the last 18 or 19 days, but we're at an important turn in the curve here, and I want to bring in Gautam Chikarmane and Chetan Bhagat. Chetan Bhagat, Shobhana Kamenini. Chetan Bhagat first. How are you visualizing the government's response right now with regards to addressing the basic concerns of those that are on the peripheries of Indian society, those that have perhaps lost their jobs, maybe for a long term, and those who are running businesses who might find themselves also going under?
Yeah. So, the government... if the cases had gone up, we would have blamed the government. So if the cases are low, they get some credit. I think the government has done a good job in controlling the corona cases so far. We don't know what's going to happen in 2 weeks, but so far so good. However, the lockdown means different. Everybody is suffering. But for the upper middle class, it's like there's nothing there's nothing else to watch on Netflix. And for the poor person, it's like there is no more food, So it's a very, very different level of suffering for all the people. And I think even developed countries have come up with massive fiscal packages, massive amounts of money, which is unthinkable, $2.3 trillion in the USA. Of course, we are not that rich. But what we have seen is some movement on that, like 15,000 crore package, this, that. But that's not going to cut it, or saying NGOs should do it, or celebrities should do it. I mean, those are all nice things to do benevolence of people, but you can't rely on charity anymore. If you're going to extend the lockdown, which it looks like they will, they should really calibrate it. Can the poor do some work? Can they get some, or is it a slightly easier lockdown possible? Second, how are they going to get compensated for it? From any profession. Take florists, people who worked in the flower mandi or grow flowers or a little flower shop there. How is he eating today? What happened to his inventory? What happened to his working capital? How will he ever come back? How will he have money to come back and buy working capital? I mean, these are real stories which are not coming out. And but the suffering is real for the people who have some assets, or even a public sector job. Their salary is guaranteed. But there is a lot of India in the unorganized sector which is suffering, and that has to come in after 3 weeks. Maybe at that day you had to announce it, but now if that is being delayed, I think that's not very fair, because to alleviate upper class panic, we are making the poor suffer a bit too much.
Okay, Gautam Chikarmane, the government usually uses the word stimulus, or at least those that speak on behalf of the government use the word stimulus to define some of these packages. Do you see this really as a stimulus?
Not only do I see, I think the government has announced that there will be another stimulus coming other than the 1.7 lakh crore that Jay Panda just mentioned. But what I would like to focus more on is, where is the stimulus going to go? You see, the stimulus comes from taxpayers' money. And if taxpayers are paying money, it shouldn't be going into the pockets of to make excessive profits. It has to go to the individuals. Now, with the JAM Trinity in place, that is a Jan Dhan account, an Aadhaar number, and a phone, with that JAM Trinity in place, I think there can be targeted transfer of money directly to individuals. Let us say, for the sake of an example, the bottom 100 million households. Other than that, the government could focus on the migrants who have been in a state of panic, and therefore they need that outreach by the government. Other than that, I think all manufacturing, all SMEs, etc., they are under pressure. They will likely remain under pressure. But on the monetary side, I believe some interest rate subventions, lowering of interest rate is not working at all, because banks are not transmitting that rate at all. In fact, I think among all constituents of India today, it is the banks, commercial banks, public sector or private sector, which are lagging the curve on COVID. They have reduced the interest rates on deposits somewhat, but they haven't reduced any rate on loans. Therefore, the transmission of whatever RBI does, let us say theoretically RBI reduces the rates to 0% tomorrow, I have zero confidence that the banks will transmit it immediately. I think banks need a little stick. I think there is enough of carrot feeding to the banks. The other point I want to make here is that for the first time I am seeing that, of course, this crisis has come for the first time also. So it's not an equal, but for the first time I am seeing that the entire Indian state, which comprises the central government, state governments, legislatures, judiciary, and even public administration, which is the civil services, has come together and are working in unison towards a certain goal. In fact, some places, the states have taken lead. For instance, in Uttar Pradesh, the government has said we will take over empty apartments and convert them into hospitals. Some other state governments are already ahead of Modi in saying that the lockdown needs to continue. So overall, I believe that the lockdown was a good idea. India has done very well in protecting its people. And I think we may want to continue with this. Problems such as poverty, SMEs, labor, unorganized sector, etc., have been existing earlier, will exist today, and continue tomorrow. I think this moment of crisis is bringing all of us together. India is a poor country. Please, let us stop comparing the India example with US, Italy, Spain. Our per capita income is $2,000. We are comparing ourselves.
Look, you've woven a massively big canvas here without actually hitting the point that I want you to comment on. I get all the problems, they're endemic problems, we understand that. Do you believe it is enough? Do you think we need to do more? Very simply put, quick answer.
Yes, we do, and it has to be targeted, like I mentioned earlier. And what we need to do is out there in the open. First is money transfer to the poor.
Okay, how do you target subsidies to individuals who are beyond the pale, who fall beyond even the jam trinity simply because they belong to the unorganized sector and they are not identifiable? That's the fundamental question. And I want to come back to Jay Panda on this. I want to ask you, Jay Panda, what about those that are, sorry to say, but beyond reach of the state? What do we do about them?
That's a very valid question. But in answering that, I want to put this in the context of what Chetan Bhagat was saying. While the economic disruption and the dangers faced by people who are at the bottom of the pyramid is very real, we should not lose track of what, putting first things first. As the Prime Minister has said, Jaan hai to jahan hai. First, it was important to break the chain of the spread of this virus. Let me repeat. The ICMR predictions were that by now we would have had nearly 1 million infections, and it has been limited to 6,000. Can you imagine if the coronavirus had been allowed to spread throughout the population in India, even with a 1 or 2% mortality rate? Can you imagine what that implies? So that's
yes, all very well understood.
Suffering. Yes, there is.
The question is about those individuals who fall beyond the pale of the state. Now, that's the biggest critical worry. Obviously, that must be a concern. How do we reach those people, sir?
I understand. But first, it must be understood that what was done so far was the first priority. And now to reach out to everybody,
sure.
There are very, very few people that are beyond the reach of the state today, particularly with the JAM trilogy, with well over 1 billion people already registered on it. And by the way, migrant populations, although they require special assistance, you will see that with the exception of 1 or 2 states, in most states, they have been reached. They are being provided food and medicines. Now, I know this because every day I'm spending up to 12 hours coordinating with hundreds of such requests. And the district administrations and other authorities throughout the country, with very few exceptions, are doing a phenomenal job of reaching out to them. So yes, there is a concern that there will be a few people who may not be reached, but as of now, almost everybody is being reached.
I want to bring in at this point Shobhana Kamini, and I want to ask her this. Shobhana Kamini, how would you rate the government's response in dealing with the epidemic? And that's the fundamental question, because a large number of people are saying, fine, you employed the lockdown early enough, but the tragedy is that we haven't tested enough, so we don't know how widespread now COVID is in this country, and therefore it becomes also difficult to assess which areas should be beyond the lockdown and which should remain locked down.
For you to judge and ask us to give numbers, first of all, is wrong, because everyone is flying blind. All I do is I've been getting up for the last 17 days and making sure that trucks are coming to our pharmacies and making sure that the stores open and people come to the stores. My scared guys, I've had 6 guys who got infected with this, and it scares everybody, but it's a national duty. So it's and one thing that I really agree what Jay Panda and Yogendra Yadav, all of them said, but you have not included the fact that along with the great work that the government is doing, it's hand in hand with the private sector, that together, that because these are uncharted times. Who has ever faced anything like this? There's no playbook that people can talk about, or there's no management guru who can tell us. The only thing that I can say is that as a medical fraternity, the good part is that there has been a lockdown, that like Jay said, it could have been a lot worse. I'm glad we did it with such depth and speed. There's 6,500 cases today. It could have spiraled out of proportion, and that would have been scary. But the interesting fact here is, remember, we have got it after China, after the US, after Italy, many countries in Europe. So there's a lot of epidemiological evidence that there's actually scientific evidence how to treat it. And I think coming from Apollo and this medical perspective, that's what we've been studying, that, it'll come. And it's true that whether it's the government or whether it's the private hospitals, we're not full yet. We're all in a constant state of preparedness. We will make sure that this country gets treatment. But also remember that the fact that we are the medicine shop of the world. India has just supplied to the US HCQ, so there's medicine available for all Indians. And I think that's the important part of from the medical side of how this disease is progressing. So it's not about...
Yeah, we hope that is indeed the case.
Yeah.
No, I'm sure, there are two ways of looking at this, optimistically, or we also look at it a bit realistically. I understand this, but as the testing has gone up, so has the infection rate. We cannot ignore this, and one just hopes that we didn't start testing too late, because we don't still know. And I want to go back to Dr. Yogendra Yadav and Pinaki Mishra and Chetan Bhagat, and I want to weave them back into this conversation. Professor Yadav, we couldn't hear you at that time, but I just wanted to bring you back on this. The question is, how do you cater to those that are beyond the pale of the state? Is it possible to reach them? And if so, what should be done?
I'm glad you're focusing on this one, Rahul, because to my mind, this is the most critical question at this moment. These are, as Dr. Shobhana says, uncharted times. So it's too early for us to either condemn the government or to congratulate ourselves. Let's focus on the job to be done. And the job to be done, as you absolutely rightly point out, is how do we reach those who we are unable to reach through Ration card, through Jan Dhan transfers, because there is at least 5% of India which is not covered by Ration card, by Jan Dhan account, by Manrega cards. How do we reach them? And to my mind, the only possibility, and this is not just my personal opinion, economists are writing, experts are writing, former agriculture secretary is writing, Jean Drèze is writing, make universal PDS for the next 2 months, which is to say, at least in rural, FCI doesn't know what to do with so much food grain that is lying with it. So give them ration for the next 2 months. That's number one. Number two, open community kitchen. Every school in the country, every government school has no midday meal because there are no students. So can that be used to feed the needy? This is an absolute must for a country of India's economic size, for a country which is looking forward to 21st century. It will be such a shame if we have hunger deaths in this country. That, to my mind, should be the topmost priority today, and that is something that we cannot rule out. So please focus on that. Two quick more suggestions before we move to something else. Number one, farmers' procurement season is coming right now. This is the worst time for a lockdown for the farmers. I know the government could not have changed the timing, but can we please ensure that every farmer's crop is purchased through the procurement centers? On that, the performance has been very low. The central government has not given guarantees that it should. And finally, for the migrant labor which is stuck in various places, either give them trains to go back home or give them some allowance for the next 2-3 months. And the allowance cannot be money transferred to women in Jan Dhan account. These migrants who are stuck here in Delhi, in Mumbai, in Nagpur, in Surat, they cannot use that. So please make sure that some minimum allowance, some cash transfers take place to these migrants. These are topmost urgent things. Let us talk about assessing the government later. We'll criticize the government later. We will compliment the government later.
Okay, well, let me quickly go across to Pinaki Mishra. Pinaki Mishra, MP of the BJD. Orissa has extended the lockdown. Why did it feel compelled to do so?
I think because we've been ahead of the curve all along. The first tracing and tracking started in Orissa much before anywhere else in India. We started that almost at the end of January. And as a result, you see today, in a population of 4.5 crores, we've basically only got about 48 cases which are identified. Every single district now is going to have a COVID hospital going forward. We've already got, I think, 8 or 9 functional and running. So Mr. Patnaik has been ahead of the curve all along, and he genuinely believes that the good results that have obtained so far, as many of your speakers have said, will need to be consolidated. And to consolidate that, we need another 15 days of at least 15 days of lockdown. And therefore, he's moved ahead. Health is a state subject. In my presentation to the Honorable Prime Minister and his cabinet the other day, I had said you must give the states the flexibility to chart their own course. And that's what Orissa government under Mr. Naveen Patnaik has done. And I think it has had universal acclaim. Everybody has said that what Orissa does today, India does tomorrow. And I have no doubt that the Honorable Prime Minister also, who indicated as much in his confabulations with us, he's going to take the same decision with the rest of India soon. There will be a further extension of the lockdown. So Mr. Patnaik, in order to ensure that there is no confusion in Orissa and in the minds of the people there, just wanted to set at rest the speculation and go ahead with it first.
Well, that is interesting. But once again, sir, an extended lockdown means that there are a large number of individuals who will not, of course, be able to return to life as usual. So how are you tackling this displacement problem?
Look, again, many of the people who've been stranded in parts of India across, there are task force teams which have been set in motion to ensure that they liaise and coordinate with those state governments to ensure, with those particular district collectors, to ensure that these people are not wanting, at least as far as food and shelter is concerned. But in this whole thing, you have to partner with the states more aggressively. The central government has to partner with the states more aggressively, because ultimately the states are in the forefront of this fight. You have to fight this through the arm of the state government. So therefore, empower the state government. All the state governments today are in a very poor shape financially, as everybody knows that. So therefore, the central government will really have to empower the state governments with everything from rations to cash, to ensure that the state governments then are able to reach out to these people in their various districts, people who've been stranded, as it were, and immediately reach out to them and give them some succor straight away. So we had mentioned this the other day as well to the Prime Minister, that this will require a much greater infusion of money than has so far been put into the kitty. Because even this 1,70,000 crores, as everybody is aware, is really, much of it is part of what has already been part of the budgetary exercise. So therefore, there is nothing which has really come now spectacularly ex gratia. Ex gratia, you will need to pull out at least 4, 5, 6 lakh crores over the next 4 to 6 months in order to immediately give relief and stimulus.
So let me pick up from this point and go across to Chetan Bhagat. Chetan Bhagat, how much do you think the government needs to give out by the way of a stimulus going forward?
Yeah, I mean, the numbers of 5 to 10 lakh crores are correct. I mean, it'll be a few thousand rupees a person. It's fair to assume, right? That would be the suffering at least. And I think you will need that. And of course, see, I mean, I don't want to be critical. We have done a good job with Corona. And the government also is losing revenue. If the economy doesn't work, the government doesn't get GST, the government doesn't get profit tax, doesn't get income tax. So in a way, the government also wants the economy to be back, because what will happen very soon is the government revenues will fall short. But I think what they are not realizing it maybe the Indian public doesn't care right now, or that they need a very big package here to do something to prevent massive suffering. You cannot, like things like, telling private labs to do the testing. I mean, how will that happen? What will you do if the private lab says, I don't have any tests? You have to pay for it, and the government may need to subsidize testing or just pay for the testing, to say that, the private labs will have to just do it. I mean, that doesn't seem to be the way to do things. So I think the lockdown the people who are thinking about the lockdown are done a good job. Then that's no longer even a debate whether we need it or not. We leave it to the experts. But the economic side, it's not really kicked in. And I'm saying, I know it's not developed, underdeveloped. Every country out there is discussing the economy versus the lockdown at the same time. I just don't see that much discussion happening on the economy right now. And I hope it does at some point. And you can't say jana hai to jana hai. Yes, jana hai to jana hai, but saving the economy also saves lives. What makes you feel that economy is only for rich billionaires? If the economy is down, the rich billionaires only lose some money mark to market. They just, in their bank account goes up and down. It doesn't really change their lifestyle. It's the poorest who suffer most when the economy is in a bad shape. So I think the economy should also be discussed as much as the lockdown.
Okay.
That's the only thing.
Jay Panda, you've heard some suggestions. Is the government moving on these suggestions?
Two things. I'm in Bhubaneswar. I have been here for the lockdown, and Odisha is the first state that has announced this extension of the lockdown by 2 weeks. My comment is that we are not going to second guess any state's decisions about these issues. We have offered unstinted support from my party and from the union government. The Prime Minister is in touch with all the chief ministers, and other ministers are in touch with their state counterparts to take these measures. And yes, many suggestions are being received. Most of them will be, all of them will be considered, and many of them will be implemented. I would like to say this: the economy is being considered. It's very unfair to say that any talk of the economy, doesn't look after the bottom of the pyramid. It's just not so. Already, we have discussed in several rounds in this conversation itself about many steps that have been taken, and other steps will be taken. The reality is, when a building is on fire, the first priority is to put the fire out, and then you start talking about rebuilding the building. There are many, many plans on the anvil. You will see other stimulus announcements. Let me give you an example about how the fire is still to be put out. Now, we didn't have a tradition in India of manufacturing PPE, personal protection equipment, and that's been a challenge. But you'll be happy to know that this week, 1 million PPE kits are going to be put out in there. They will be sent out to the states. And similarly, in terms of tests, we've had to scale up the test kits availability. They've gone up from just a few thousands to now about 1.5 lakh tests. And this week, it's going to be another 7 lakh test kits that are going to be sent out throughout the states. So the union government is working hand in hand with the states. I think Ms. Akinani made a very important point about partnering with the private sector. Now, in the states, for example, there's a good example in Bolangir, for instance, which is in Western Odisha, a remote part. There's an agreement with the private institution and the government stepping in, with kits coming in from the union government. This is how partnership ought to work, so that testing is available throughout the length and breadth of the country. We can do this. The economy is being thought about. Steps have already been taken. More steps will be taken, but we have yet to beat the crisis. We have done very well so far. We can't drop the ball.
Okay, well, the debate will rage on. The point is that these are uncharted waters. Suggestions are more than welcome, and of course they must be taken in that spirit, because a suggestion, conversation, open mind will allow us to constantly evolve strategies to defeat corona and the attendant side effects that we are likely to experience at every level of society. This particular program was about getting the voices out there so that they can be heard by the government when and if they are formulating a response on a larger scale or at the next level. We leave it at this.